The Montana wind hit different than back home in Pennsylvania. It didn't whisper through cornfields or rattle window panes. It announced itself, carrying the smell of sagebrush and something Naomi couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Or just distance. She'd been on that train for 8 days. 8 days of hard benches and stale bread, watching America roll past in shades of brown and gray. The other passengers had thinned out at each stop, families heading to established towns, men with mining claims, a widow rejoining her sister in Billings. By the time the conductor called out Stillwater Junction, Naomi was one of 3 people left in the car. The other 2 were cowpunchers who'd spent the last 100 miles playing cards and spitting tobacco juice into a dented can. They hadn't looked at her once, which suited her fine. She'd gotten used to being invisible over the years. The spinster daughter, the one who'd stayed home to care for her father through his long decline, the one whose bloom had supposedly faded before it ever really opened. Except Thomas Brennan had seen her, or so his letters claimed. She pulled the most recent one from her coat pocket now, unfolding it carefully despite knowing every word by heart. "My dearest Naomi," it began, in that confident script she'd traced with her fingertips 100 times. "The days grow longer as I await your arrival. I have prepared a home for us, nothing fancy but honest and sturdy, like the life we'll build together. The mountains here touch the sky, and I cannot wait to show you." The train shuddered and began to slow. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd answered a matrimonial advertisement 6 months ago, desperate and practical in equal measure. Her father had been dead 3 months, the house sold to pay his debts, and her brother's wife had made it painfully clear that Naomi's presence in their household was temporary charity, not permanent welcome. Respectable rancher, 35, seeks companionship of a good woman, must be of sound character and willing temperament. Prospects are excellent for the right match. The ad had been brief, almost cold, but Thomas's letters, those had been something else entirely. He wrote about sunsets that painted the whole valley gold, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands, about loneliness that wasn't quite suffering but felt like waiting for a missing piece. Naomi had let herself believe she might be that piece. The train groaned to a complete stop. Through the window, she could see Stillwater Junction was barely a town. A scattering of wooden buildings slumped against the landscape like they were tired of fighting the wind. The depot was just a covered platform, and standing on it were maybe a dozen people. One of them was Thomas. Had to be. She recognized him from the single photograph he'd sent, a stiff studio portrait showing a square-jawed man with serious eyes and dark hair combed back from a high forehead. In the picture, he'd looked solid, capable, like someone who meant what he said. The man on the platform was laughing. Naomi stood, smoothing her traveling dress. It was the best thing she owned, dark blue wool, carefully mended at the cuffs, with buttons she'd replaced herself just before leaving. She told herself she was being practical, not vain. First impressions mattered, even in Montana. Especially in Montana. She made her way down the narrow aisle, carpet bag in one hand, her small trunk to be retrieved from the baggage car. The conductor, an older man who'd been kind during the journey, tipped his hat as she passed. "Good luck to you, miss," he said, and something in his tone made her stomach clench. The platform steps were steep. Naomi descended carefully, aware that every eye had turned toward her. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. Thomas Brennan stood in the center of a group of men, ranch hands and townies by the look of them, all wearing that particular expression men got when they were in on a joke. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders, but his face matched the photograph well enough. What didn't match was the smirk twisting his mouth. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Right on time." Naomi tried to smile. Her lips felt strange, numb from the cold or from nerves. "Mr. Brennan? Oh, I know who you are." He took a step forward, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Naomi Carter, spinster of Pennsylvania, 27 years old, no prospects, no family to speak of." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, one of her letters. Desperate enough to travel 1,000 miles to marry a man she's never met. The men around him snickered. Naomi felt heat flooding her face. I don't understand." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Thomas turned to his companions, grinning. "Boys, let me tell you about a wager. 6 months ago, Charlie here." He clapped a hand on the shoulder of a pockmarked man to his left. Charlie bet me $20 I couldn't get some Eastern spinster to actually show up out here. Said no woman in her right mind would come all this way on just letters. The pockmarked man laughed. I'll be damned, Tommy. You actually did it. Of course I did. Thomas waved Naomi's letter like a trophy. You write them pretty enough. They'll believe anything. Talk about loneliness and sunsets and building a future. Christ, it was easier than breaking a green horse. Naomi couldn't breathe. The platform seemed to tilt under her feet. So there's no... She couldn't even finish the sentence. No ranch? Thomas shook his head, still grinning. Oh, I got a ranch, all right. Got a wife, too. Married Clara Hodge 3 years ago. He gestured toward a woman standing in the doorway of the general store, a plump blonde in a yellow dress who was watching the scene with undisguised amusement. This was just for fun, and $20, which Charlie's about to hand over. The world contracted to a single point of humiliation. Naomi stood there, carpetbag in hand, while laughter rolled over her like a wave. The other passengers had stopped to watch. The depot agent was shaking his head. Even the conductor, who'd been kind just moments ago, was looking at her with pity. Pity was almost worse than mockery. You wrote me letters for 6 months, Naomi said, and hated how her voice shook. You told me... I told you what you wanted to hear, Thomas interrupted. Same as you told me what I wanted to hear. Don't act like you weren't trying to snag yourself a husband any way you could. I was honest in every... You were desperate. He said it flatly, without malice, which somehow made it worse. Desperate women make easy marks. Figured you'd realize halfway here and turn back, but hell, he laughed again. You actually showed up. Gotta respect the commitment, even if it's stupid. One of the other men, a lean fellow with tobacco-stained teeth, spoke up. What's she gonna do now, Tommy? Can't exactly get back on that train without money for a ticket. Thomas shrugged. Not my problem. I won the bet. What she does next is her own business. Naomi felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. That felt too poetic, too clean. This was messier, like a piece of furniture breaking under weight it was never meant to carry. She'd sold everything. The furniture from her father's house, the few pieces of her mother's jewelry, even the quilt her grandmother had made. She'd used that money for the train ticket and had maybe $7 left to her name. $7 in a town where she knew no one, had no prospects, and was now the subject of public ridicule. I need... She swallowed hard. Is there a hotel? Somewhere I might find work? Thomas jerked his thumb toward a sagging 2-story building at the far end of the street. Brennan House takes lodgers, run by my cousin. Doubt he'll hire you. We got all the help we need, but you can ask. Of course it was his cousin. Of course. Naomi bent to pick up her carpetbag, and that's when she noticed her trunk still sitting on the platform where the porter had left it. Everything she owned was in that trunk. Not much, clothes mostly, and a few books, and the silver-backed brush that had been her mother's. She looked at it, and then at the distance to the hotel, and felt a new wave of despair. She couldn't carry both. I'll watch it for you, a voice said. Naomi turned. A man stood slightly apart from Thomas's group, older, maybe 40, with weathered skin and gray threading through dark hair. He wore working clothes, nothing fancy, and his eyes were the color of winter sky. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't smirking either. I don't need charity, Naomi said, too sharply. Didn't offer charity, offered to watch your trunk. The man's voice was quiet, flat as the horizon. No charge. You can come back for it when you're ready. Thomas snorted. Hell, Elias, you gonna rescue her? That'd be rich. The hermit and the desperate spinster. The gray-eyed man, Elias, didn't even look at Thomas. He kept his gaze on Naomi, waiting. She should refuse, should maintain some scrap of dignity, but dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford, and the trunk was heavy. Thank you, she said. Elias nodded once and moved to stand beside her trunk, casual as a fence post. The message was clear. He'd keep his word. Naomi picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward the hotel. Behind her, she could hear Thomas and his friends already moving on to other entertainment, the spectacle of her humiliation already fading into just another story they'd tell over drinks. The wind picked up, carrying dust that stung her eyes. Or maybe those were tears. She wasn't sure anymore. Brennan House looked worse up close. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged in the middle, and the windows needed washing, but the sign hanging over the door said, "Lodging meals, inquire within." And that was all Naomi had to work with. She pushed through the door into a dim front room that smelled of old coffee and unwashed wool. A desk stood against one wall, unattended. Naomi rang the small bell sitting on top of it and waited. A man emerged from a back room, younger than Thomas, with the same general build but a softer face. This would be the cousin. "Help you?" he asked, not unkindly. "I need a room," Naomi said. "Just for tonight, and I'm looking for work, if you're hiring." The man's expression shifted, sympathy mixing with awkwardness. "You're the one from the train. The one Tommy—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Look, miss, I'm sorry about that. My cousin's got a mean streak when he's been drinking. He seemed quite sober. That's the worst part." The man sighed. "Name's Daniel Brennan. I run this place, such as it is. I can give you a room for the night, 50 cents, but I can't hire you. Got my wife and daughter helping with the cooking and cleaning, and business ain't good enough to justify another wage." 50 cents. Naomi calculated quickly. That would leave her with $6.50, maybe enough for a week's lodging if she skipped meals. Then what? "Is there anyone else in town who might be hiring?" she asked. "I can cook, clean, keep accounts. I helped my father run his dry goods store for years." Daniel scratched his jaw. "Nearest dry goods store is in Big Timber, 30 miles east. We got a general store here, but Porter runs it with his sons. Family operation. There's the saloon, but I wouldn't recommend—" "No," Naomi said quickly. She'd have to be far more desperate before she considered that. "Might try the surrounding ranches," Daniel continued. "Spring roundup's coming, and some of the bigger outfits hire extra help for cooking and such. But you'd need a way to get out there, and—" He trailed off, the unspoken obvious. She had no horse, no wagon, no way to travel. Naomi felt the walls closing in. "The room, then. For tonight. Top of the stairs, second door on the right. Wash basins in the room, privies out back. Breakfast is served at 7 if you want it. 20 cents. She paid him the 50 cents and climbed the stairs, each step feeling like surrender. The room was small and cold, with a narrow bed, a chair, and a washstand. The single window looked out over the main street, all 4 buildings of it. Naomi set down her carpet bag and sank onto the bed. It didn't give much. The mattress was thin, lumpy, probably stuffed with straw. She could feel the ropes underneath. For 6 months, she'd imagined her arrival in Montana. The fantasy had varied in details, but always hit the same notes. Thomas waiting on the platform with a buggy, the drive to his ranch, seeing the home he'd prepared. Maybe a little awkward at first, they were strangers after all, but warm beneath that. Coffee while they talked. The slow building of something real. She'd known it wouldn't be easy. Frontier life was hard, everyone said so, but she'd thought the hardship would come from the work, the weather, the isolation. Not from cruelty, not from being a joke. Naomi pulled her knees to her chest and let herself cry. Not the gentle tears of ladylike sorrow, but ugly gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the money she'd spent, for the life she'd left behind, for the stupidity of hope. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollowed out. Empty. The light through the window had shifted. Afternoon was bleeding into evening. She should go retrieve her trunk before dark, before whoever that man was, Elias, gave up and left. She washed her face in the basin, wincing at how cold the water was. Her reflection in the small mirror looked haggard, red eyes, blotchy skin, hair coming loose from its pins. 27 and looking 40. Thomas had called her a spinster. He'd said it like an insult, but it was just the truth. She'd never been pretty, too tall, too angular, features too sharp. And she'd spent her 20s caring for an invalid father instead of courting. By the time he died, she was well past the age when men looked twice. The matrimonial ad had been her last chance, and she'd known it. Now she had nothing. Naomi repinned her hair, straightened her dress, and went back downstairs. The front room was empty. She stepped out into the street, into the gathering dusk. The platform was mostly deserted now. The train had gone, heading west toward the real towns, the places that mattered. Her trunk still sat where the porter had left it. Elias still stood beside it. He hadn't moved, as far as Naomi could tell. Just stood there, patient as stone, keeping his word. "I'm sorry," she said as she approached. "I didn't mean to be so long." "No hurry." He stepped back, giving her space. Up close, Naomi could see he was older than she'd first thought, closer to 45 than 40. His face was lined from sun and wind, and there was a scar along his left jaw, faded white with age. He wore work clothes that had been mended more than once, and his boots were scuffed nearly smooth. "Can you help me carry it to the hotel?" She hated asking, but the trunk was too heavy for her to manage alone. Elias picked it up like it weighed nothing, balanced it on one shoulder. "Lead the way." They walked in silence. Naomi was aware of eyes watching from windows, tongues probably already wagging about the hermit and the desperate spinster. Let them talk. She'd already endured the worst humiliation this town could offer. At the hotel, Elias carried the trunk upstairs without being asked, set it down in her room with care. Then he stood there, hat in hands, looking uncertain for the first time. "I'm not going to rob you," Naomi said, irritated. "You can leave." "Wasn't worried about that." Elias turned his hat in his hands. "Was wondering if you had any plans." "Plans for what?" "For where you go next." Naomi laughed, bitter. "I have $7 to my name and no prospects. I suppose my plan is to starve slowly while providing entertainment for your charming town." Something shifted in Elias's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Town ain't mine. I live about 8 miles out, up in the foothills. Got a homestead there." "Good for you. It's just me," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Been working it alone for 3 years. Could use help with the spring work, planting, repairs, managing the stock. It's hard work. Long days, nothing fancy." Naomi stared at him. "Are you offering me a job?" "Offering you work? Yes. Room and board included. Separate sleeping quarters. I got a bunkhouse that's sound, just needs airing out. Fair warning, I'm not much for conversation, and the place is isolated. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles off, but the work's honest, and you'd earn your keep." It was too much like Thomas's offer, too similar to the trap she'd just fallen into. "Why?" Naomi asked flatly. "Why would you help me?" Elias considered the question seriously. "Partly because I do need help. Ranch work's too much for one person. Partly because what happened to you today was wrong, and I don't hold with that kind of meanness." He paused. "Mostly because you looked like you needed an option that wasn't staying here or getting back on a train with no money." "And what do you get out of it?" She couldn't keep the suspicion from her voice. "Besides help with the work?" "Just that. Help with the work." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not Thomas Brennan. I don't play games, and I don't make promises I can't keep. You want the job, it's yours. You don't, that's fine too. But you should know, spring's the hardest season on a ranch. If you can't handle it, better to say so now." Naomi thought about her $7, about the empty streets of Stillwater Junction, about the long miles back to Pennsylvania and the brother's wife who'd made it clear she wasn't welcome. "How long?" she asked. "Season runs through June. 3 months, give or take. After that, you can stay on if the work suits, or take your wages and head wherever you like." "What are the wages?" "Room, board, and $10 a month." He said it plainly, without apology. It was insultingly low. A male ranch hand would make 30, maybe 40. But Naomi wasn't a male ranch hand, and she had no leverage to negotiate. "When would I start?" "Tomorrow. If you're willing, I'll come by with the wagon at first light." Naomi looked around the small, cold room, looked at her trunk with all her worldly possessions, looked at Elias Vance, who'd kept his word about something as simple as watching her luggage. She had no good options, but some bad options were less bad than others. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow at first light." Elias nodded, put his hat back on. "I'll be here." He left without another word, boots heavy on the stairs. Naomi sat down on the bed and tried to think. She'd just agreed to go 8 miles into the wilderness with a strange man. It could be disaster, could be danger, could be another humiliation waiting to unfold. But it could also be survival. She thought about Thomas's laughter, about the way the whole town had watched her shame like it was theater, about the simple, stark choice in front of her. Take a risk or give up entirely. Naomi had come 1,000 miles on a lie. She could go 8 more on a maybe. She opened her trunk and started sorting through her things, deciding what she'd need for ranch work. The blue wool dress would be useless. She had one serviceable cotton dress, a skirt and shirtwaist that could handle rough use, and an old coat her father had worn that she'd kept for sentimental reasons. Not much to build a life on. But then again, she'd started with less that morning. The sun set over Stillwater Junction, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Naomi had been in any state to notice. She ate a cold supper from the supplies in her carpet bag, cheese and hard bread she'd bought 2 days ago at a train station in Dakota Territory. Tomorrow she'd start again. Different than she'd planned, harder than she'd hoped, but still a start. She lay down on the thin mattress and pulled the rough blanket up to her chin. Sleep wouldn't come easy. Her mind kept replaying the scene on the platform, Thomas's smirk, the laughter of men who'd never risked anything in their comfortable, cruel lives. But eventually, exhaustion won. Naomi slept dreamless and deep, and when she woke to the first gray light of dawn, she was ready. The wagon rattled up to Brennan House just as the first pink streaks appeared in the eastern sky. Naomi had been awake for an hour, sitting on the edge of her bed with her carpet bag packed and her trunk latched. She'd slept maybe 3 hours total, her mind churning through every possible disaster that might await her. When she heard the creak of wheels outside, she stood and looked out the window. Elias sat on the bench of a weathered farm wagon, 2 horses in the traces. He didn't call out or knock, just sat there, reins in hand, waiting. Naomi grabbed her bags and headed downstairs. Daniel Brennan was already up, stoking the fire in the front room stove. "You're really going with him?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. "I am. Elias Vance is—" Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not a bad man, quiet, keeps to himself. But he's been alone up there a long time. Some folks say too long." "What does that mean?" Daniel shrugged. "Just that isolation does things to people, makes them strange. You might find it harder than you think." Naomi picked up her carpet bag. "I'll manage." Outside, the morning air bit through her coat. Elias climbed down from the wagon and took her trunk without a word, securing it in the bed alongside what looked like supplies: sacks of flour and cornmeal, a crate of canning jars, coils of rope. He helped her up onto the bench, then climbed back up himself. "Ready?" he asked. Naomi nodded. They pulled away from Brennan House as the town began to stir. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. Naomi didn't look back. The road, barely more than 2 ruts worn into the prairie, led northeast, away from what passed for civilization. The horses settled into a steady walk, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Elias drove in silence, his attention on the terrain. After half an hour, Naomi couldn't stand it anymore. "How long have you had the homestead?" she asked. 3 years come August." "You mentioned it's just you, no family?" "Not anymore." His tone didn't invite further questions. Naomi fell silent again, watching the landscape change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain dotted with pine and aspen. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. Snow still capped their peaks despite it being early April. The beauty of it would have taken her breath away if she'd been in any state to appreciate beauty. Instead, she just felt small. The land here was too big, too empty. It made her think of all the ways a person could disappear. "You have experience with ranch work?" Elias asked, breaking the silence. "No, I grew up in a town, helped my father with his store." "Can you cook?" "Yes, basic things, nothing fancy." "Don't need fancy, just need it edible." He glanced at her. "You know anything about animals? Chickens, pigs, cattle?" "I know what they are." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "That's a start. The chickens are mean, the pigs are meaner. The cattle don't much care either way as long as you feed them." "What about horses?" "Got 2 besides these?" He nodded at the team pulling the wagon, Molly and Red. Molly's gentle enough. Red's got opinions. They climbed higher into the foothills. The road, if it could even be called that, became rougher, forcing them to slow. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches heavy with old snow. Naomi saw deer tracks in the mud, and once, something larger that might have been elk. "We get bears up here," Elias said, following her gaze. "Grizzlies, mostly. They come down from the high country in spring, looking for easy meals. Don't go wandering off alone, especially at dusk." "Noted." Naomi wrapped her coat tighter. The temperature had dropped as they climbed. "Mountain lions, too. They're sneakier, less likely to bother you if you're near the house, but keep your eyes open in the timber." This was a mistake. The thought came unbidden, insistent. She'd traded one disaster for another. At least in Stillwater Junction, the dangers were human-sized. Out here, she could be eaten. The wagon crested a rise, and Elias pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said, pointing. Below them, tucked into a narrow valley, sat a cluster of buildings. The main house was small, one-story, log construction with a stone chimney. Beside it stood a barn in slightly better repair, and beyond that a structure that might have been the bunkhouse Elias had mentioned. A split-rail fence enclosed a pasture where a few cattle grazed, looking scraggly and underfed. Everything had the worn, tired look of a place hanging on by its fingernails. Naomi's heart sank. "It needs work," Elias said, reading her expression. "That's why I need help." They descended into the valley. Up close, the homestead looked even worse. The house's roof sagged in one corner, and several window shutters hung crooked. The barn door didn't quite close properly. The bunkhouse was missing half its shingles. Elias brought the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down. "I'll show you around. Won't take long." That was an understatement. The tour consisted of house, barn, bunkhouse, chicken coop, root cellar, and privy. The whole operation could fit inside a city block with room to spare. The house was marginally better inside than out. One main room served as kitchen and living area, with a fireplace at one end and a cast-iron stove at the other. A door led to what Elias called his room. Naomi didn't look inside. The furniture was rough-hewn and minimal: a table, 2 chairs, a bench, some shelves. Everything was clean but sparse, like a place where someone existed rather than lived. "I usually eat here," Elias said, gesturing at the table. "You're welcome to the same, or you can cook for yourself in the bunkhouse if you prefer. There's a stove out there, but it needs some work." The bunkhouse was worse than Naomi had imagined. A long, narrow building divided into 4 sections, each with a bunk and not much else. The windows were grimy, the floor was dirt, and mouse droppings littered every corner. It smelled of mildew and neglect. "Told you it needed airing out," Elias said. Naomi stood in the doorway, trying not to let her dismay show. "Which bunk is mine?" "Whichever you want. They're all the same." She chose the one farthest from the door, mainly because it had the least mouse evidence. Her trunk looked ridiculous in the empty space. Too refined. Too much a reminder of the life she'd thought she was coming to. "I'll let you get settled," Elias said. "Come up to the house when you're ready. We'll go over the work." After he left, Naomi sat on the bunk and looked around her new home. The mattress was thin, the blanket was wool and scratchy, and the whole place felt like a tomb. Through the small window, she could see the mountains looming in the distance. She'd made a terrible mistake, but she'd made it, and there was no going back. Not with $7, now $6.50 after breakfast that morning, to her name. Not with 1,000 miles between her and anything familiar. Naomi unpacked her trunk methodically. Dresses hung on nails driven into the wall. Undergarments went in a crate she found in the corner. Books, she'd brought 4, stacked beside the bunk. Her mother's silver brush sat on top of them, gleaming incongruously in the dim light. When everything was as organized as it could be in such a space, she washed her face and hands in the basin Elias had filled, then headed to the main house. He was waiting at the table with 2 cups of coffee and what looked like a list. "Sit," he said. Naomi sat. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and she was grateful. Elias pushed the list toward her. His handwriting was neat, almost careful. "This is what needs doing before planting. Some of it we'll do together. Some you can handle alone once you know how." Naomi scanned the list. Repair fence in south pasture. Clear irrigation ditches. Mend barn roof. Plant kitchen garden. Check cattle for injuries and disease. Shear sheep. She hadn't seen any sheep. Process wool. Repair bunkhouse roof. Clean chicken coop. Slaughter pig for spring meat. The list went on. "This is..." She looked up. "This is months of work. That's why I said spring's the hardest season." Elias took a sip of his coffee. "We'll start with the essentials. Fence first. Can't have the cattle wandering off. Then the irrigation, because if we don't get water to the fields, nothing grows. The rest will fit in as we can. I don't know how to do any of this." "I'll teach you." He said it simply, like it was obvious. "You know how to use your hands?" "Yes." "Then you can learn the rest." They started that same morning. Elias loaded tools into the wagon: post hole digger, hammer, wire cutters, a bag of nails, and they drove to the south pasture. The fence there was in terrible shape, with entire sections collapsed and wire hanging loose like broken spider webs. Previous owner let it go, Elias explained, climbing down. Didn't have the money or the energy to maintain it. By the time I bought the place, half the infrastructure was shot. Why buy it then? He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like emotion in his face. Because it was mine. Nobody else's. Just mine. They worked in silence after that. Elias showed her how to dig a post hole, harder than it looked, especially in the rocky soil, how to set a post straight and tamp the earth around it, how to string wire tight enough to keep cattle in, but not so tight it would snap in winter cold. The work was brutal. Within an hour, Naomi's hands were blistered. Within 2, her back was screaming. She'd thought she knew what hard work felt like. She'd scrubbed floors, hauled water, worked her father's store from dawn to dusk. But this was different. This was her whole body protesting, muscles she didn't know she had burning with each movement. Elias didn't slow down, didn't offer rest or sympathy. He just kept working, steady as a machine, and expected her to keep pace. By midday, they'd repaired maybe 20 feet of fence. Hundreds of feet remained. "We'll break for dinner," Elias said, straightening up. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. Dinner was bread and dried meat, eaten standing up because Naomi couldn't bear to sit, only to have to stand again. Elias handed her a canteen of water, and she drank deeply, not caring that it tasted of metal. "You're doing all right," he said. "I'm slow." "You're learning. That's different." He took the canteen back, drank, wiped his mouth. "Most people would have quit by now. Gone back to town, taken their chances there. I don't quit." Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but close. "Good, because this doesn't get easier." They worked until the light started to fail, then loaded the tools and headed back to the house. Naomi's hands were raw, her shoulders were knots of pain, and she was so tired she could barely think. "There's stew in the pot," Elias said as they unhitched the horses. "Help yourself. And there's salve in the cabinet by the stove. Put it on those blisters before bed." Naomi ate mechanically, too exhausted to taste anything. The stew was fine. Meat and potatoes and carrots, simple and filling. She washed her bowl, found the salve, and stumbled back to the bunkhouse. She fell onto the bunk fully clothed, her hands throbbing. Sleep came like a hammer. The next day was worse, and the day after that. They worked the fence from dawn until dark, stopping only for brief meals that Naomi barely remembered eating. Her hands developed calluses on top of the blisters. Her back stopped hurting in specific places and just became one generalized ache. But the fence got repaired. After a week, Elias declared it good enough and moved on to the irrigation ditches. These were narrow channels cut into the hillside, designed to carry snowmelt down to the fields. Winter had clogged them with debris, fallen branches, leaves, rocks, the occasional dead animal. "We clear them now, while there's still runoff," Elias explained. "In another month, it'll be too dry." They worked their ways up the hillside, shovels and rakes in hand, pulling out muck and trash. The water was ice cold. Naomi's boots leaked. By the end of each day, her feet were numb. She stopped noticing after a while, stopped thinking. Her world narrowed to the immediate. Dig here, pull that, stack those rocks. Her body moved on its own, finding rhythms she didn't know it possessed. Sometimes Elias talked while they worked. Not much, but enough to break the silence. He told her about the land, about how the valley had been formed by an ancient glacier, about how the weather patterns worked in the mountains. He pointed out animal tracks and explained what made them. Once, when they found a bear's winter den, he showed her how to tell if it was occupied or abandoned. "Empty," he said, peering into the dark opening. "Been empty since last fall. The bear probably denned up somewhere higher." "How can you tell?" "No smell, no fresh sign. And look." He pointed at the entrance, where grass had started to grow. Nature doesn't waste time reclaiming empty spaces. Naomi thought about that later, lying in her bunk, about empty spaces and reclamation, about what it meant to be discarded and whether anything could grow in the places people left behind. 2 weeks into her employment, she woke to find snow falling. Not the light dusting they'd had a few times, but real snow, thick and fast, already accumulating on the ground. Elias was in the barn when she found him, forking hay to the cattle. "Is this normal?" she asked. "It's almost May. It's Montana." He didn't look up. "I've seen snow in June." It'll melt off in a few days. What do we do in the meantime? Inside work. The barn needs mucking, the tack needs mending, and I've got tools that need sharpening. He paused. And you should probably learn how to milk a cow. The cow in question was named Bessie, and she had opinions about strangers. She expressed these opinions by kicking over the milk bucket 3 times before Naomi got the hang of it. She's testing you, Elias said, watching from the stall door. Once she knows you're not going to give up, she'll settle. How do you know I'm not going to give up? Because you're still here. On the 4th try, Naomi managed to get a decent amount of milk before Bessie's patience ran out. Her hands cramped from the unfamiliar motion, and her forehead hurt from where she'd been resting it against Bessie's flank. But she'd done it. Better, Elias said. Tomorrow, you'll be faster. The snow kept falling. They worked inside, mending, cleaning, organizing. The barn was warmer than the bunkhouse, and Naomi found herself lingering there, finding excuses to stay near the animals and the work. On the 2nd day of snow, Elias brought out a whetstone and showed her how to sharpen tools. It was finicky work, requiring patience and a feel for the right angle. Naomi ruined the edge on a hoe blade before she got the hang of it. It's all right, Elias said. Metal can be reground. That's the thing about tools. They can take a beating and still be useful, long as you maintain them. Is that a metaphor? He looked surprised, then almost smiled. Maybe. That night, the snow stopped. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The world transformed into something white and pristine. It hurt to look at. They dug out paths to the barn, the chicken coop, the privy. The snow was heavy, wet, already starting to melt where the sun hit it. By afternoon, water was running everywhere, turning the ground into soup. This is why we cleared the ditches, Elias said, watching the water flow down the channels they'd excavated. All this runoff needs somewhere to go, or it just turns everything into a swamp. The garden couldn't wait any longer. Snow or no snow, if they didn't get seeds in the ground soon, there wouldn't be vegetables come summer. They spent 3 days preparing the plot, turning soil that was half mud, half ice, mixing in manure from the barn, marking out rows with stakes and string. Naomi's hands, just starting to heal from the fence work, cracked open again. But she kept working. Elias showed her how to plant each type of seed. How deep, how far apart, how much water. Potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, onions. The list went on. Each seed was a small act of faith that something would grow. You ever done this before? Naomi asked, sitting back on her heels. Her knees were soaked, her back was protesting, but there was something satisfying about the neat rows stretching out before her. My mother had a garden, Elias said. Back in Missouri. She made all of us kids help with it. Hated it at the time. Now I'm grateful. It was the most personal thing he'd shared. Naomi waited, hoping he'd say more, but he just returned to planting. That evening, exhausted and filthy, Naomi heated water on the bunkhouse stove and did her best to wash. The cold was brutal, the water barely warm enough to matter, but she couldn't stand another day of accumulated dirt. As she dried off, shivering, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror she'd propped on a shelf. She barely recognized her reflection. Her face was thinner, tanned from the sun and wind. Her hands were rough, nails broken and dirty despite scrubbing. But there was something else too, something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone who could survive. The next few weeks blurred together. They moved from task to task, crisis to crisis. A section of the barn roof gave way during a rainstorm, and they spent 2 days patching it with whatever materials they could scavenge. 3 of the chickens got into a fight and had to be separated, one so badly injured that Elias had to put it down. Naomi watched him do it, a quick twist of the neck, efficient and final, and felt nothing. Just another necessary thing. In late May, one of the cattle went missing. They spent a day searching, following tracks up into the timber. Elias brought his rifle, and Naomi understood without being told. Predators. They found the steer in a ravine, dead but not eaten. Broken leg, probably from a fall. Damn, Elias said quietly. That's $100 I don't have. They couldn't leave the carcass. It would draw bears. So they spent the rest of the day butchering it where it lay, salvaging what meat they could carry. It was grim work, bloody and exhausting. Naomi's stomach turned more than once, but she kept at it. You're tougher than you look, Elias said as they packed the meat and salt for the trip back. I didn't have a choice about getting tough. We always have a choice. You could have stayed soft. Some people do. They just break instead of bending. Naomi thought about Thomas Brennan, about the men who'd laughed at her humiliation. I'm not interested in breaking. I noticed. They hauled the meat back to the homestead and spent the next 2 days processing it, cutting, salting, hanging it in the smokehouse. Naomi's arms ached from the work, and the smell of blood seemed to have soaked into her skin, but the smokehouse was full. That was worth something. June arrived with heat that felt wrong after so much cold. The garden sprouted, fragile green shoots pushing through the dark soil. The cattle grazed contentedly in pastures that had finally turned green. The days stretched longer, light lingering until nearly 9 o'clock. Naomi fell into a routine without quite noticing. Wake before dawn. Milk Bessie. Feed the chickens. Help Elias with whatever was most urgent that day. Eat. Work until dark. Collapse. Repeat. Her body changed. Muscles developed where there had been none. Her hands became capable of things she'd never imagined, splitting wood, mending harness, holding a struggling sheep still while Elias sheared it. Her mind changed too. The constant hum of anxiety that had followed her from Pennsylvania began to quiet. Not because life was easier, it wasn't, but because there was no room for it. Anxiety required energy she needed for actual survival. She and Elias developed a rhythm. He was a man of few words, but the words he spoke mattered. He didn't waste breath on pleasantries or small talk. If he told her something, it was because she needed to know it. And slowly, carefully, she began to trust him. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of decision. It was just that day after day, he did exactly what he said he would do. No lies, no tricks, no cruelty hiding behind false kindness. He was exactly who he appeared to be. One evening in mid-June, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The day's work was done. Dinner, rabbit stew that Naomi had made, getting better at cooking over an open fire, sat warm in their bellies. 3 months, Elias said. Naomi looked at him. What? You've been here 3 months. That was the agreement. Stay through the season, then decide if you want to keep on or move on. She'd forgotten. Or maybe not forgotten exactly, but stopped thinking about it. The future had become something vague and distant, unimportant compared to the immediate concerns of keeping the homestead running. I haven't paid you yet, Elias continued. $30 by my count. I can get it to you by week's end. $30. It seemed like both a fortune and nothing at all. Enough to get her to another town, maybe. Enough to start over somewhere else. Not enough to truly change her circumstances. You want me to leave? Naomi asked. Didn't say that. Just said the agreement was 3 months. You've more than held up your end. If you want to collect your wages and go, that's your right. The sun was sinking lower, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. From this vantage point, Naomi could see everything they'd accomplished: the repaired fences, the green fields, the garden rows thick with growing vegetables. The barn roof no longer sagged. The bunkhouse had all its shingles. Where would I go? She asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. There's towns north of here, bigger than Stillwater. You could find work, maybe, find a different situation. A different situation. Naomi almost laughed. You mean find another ad in a newspaper, try again with another stranger? I didn't mean... I know what you meant. She wasn't angry, just tired. You're giving me an out, being decent about it, but I don't want an out. He looked at her then, really looked, and Naomi met his gaze without flinching. The work here is hard, Elias said. It doesn't get easier. Winter's worse than you can imagine. We'll be snowed in for months, just the two of us and whatever supplies we can lay by. No neighbors, no town, nothing but work and cold and making do. I know. You don't, though. You've only seen the easy part. Naomi laughed, sharp and genuine. If this is the easy part, I'm terrified to see the hard part. But I'm not leaving. Why not? It was a fair question. Naomi considered it seriously. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not useless. I'm not the spinster daughter taking up space. I'm not the burden nobody wants. Here, I work, and the work matters. When I fix something, it stays fixed. When I plant something, it grows. That means something. Elias nodded slowly. All right then. If you're staying, we should discuss terms. I can go to $10 a month still, or, he paused, working something out in his head. Or we could work out a different arrangement, partnership maybe. You'd have a share in the homestead, profits and losses both. It wouldn't be much, not for years, but it would be yours. Naomi's heart kicked against her ribs. Why would you do that? Because this place needs 2 people to run it proper. I've been limping by alone, but that's all it is, limping. With 2 of us, we could actually build something, and you've earned it. The work you've done these 3 months is worth more than $30. I don't know anything about being a partner in a ranch. Neither do I. We'll figure it out as we go. It was insane. A partnership with a man she'd known for 3 months, on a hardscrabble homestead in the middle of nowhere with winter coming and no guarantee of success. But it was also real, solid, honest. All right, Naomi said. Partnership. They shook on it there on the porch as the last light faded from the sky. Elias's hand was calloused and warm, his grip firm. We should probably draw up papers, he said. Make it legal. I'll ride into town next week, find someone who can do it proper. Elias? Yeah? Thank you. For this. For all of it. He looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. You did the work. I just gave you the chance. That night, lying in her bunk, Naomi thought about chance and choice and the strange paths that led people to where they needed to be. She'd come to Montana chasing a lie. She'd been humiliated, abandoned, left with nothing. And somehow, against all odds, she'd found something real. The next morning, they got back to work. Summer was coming, which meant haying season, which meant 14-hour days in the blazing sun. But Naomi didn't mind. She was building something now, not just surviving, but building. And that made all the difference. Summer hit the valley like a fist, the kind of heat that shimmered up from the ground in waves, making distances impossible to judge and turning every task into an endurance test. Naomi learned to work in the early mornings and late evenings, retreating to shade during the brutal midday hours when even the cattle stood motionless under the trees. The hay came in thick that year. She and Elias spent 2 weeks cutting, raking, and stacking it in the barn loft. The work was repetitive, mind-numbing, and absolutely crucial. No hay meant no winter feed, which meant no cattle, which meant no income. Everything depended on getting it right. Naomi's arms ached from swinging the scythe. Her shoulders burned from pitching hay onto the wagon, but she kept pace with Elias, matching him load for load, and if he noticed the strain it cost her, he had the grace not to mention it. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Comfortable. The kind between people who didn't need to fill every moment with noise. One afternoon, taking a water break in the shade of the barn, Elias asked, "You ever think about going back? To Pennsylvania?" Naomi wiped sweat from her face with her sleeve. "No, there's nothing there for me." "No friends? Nobody you miss?" "I had acquaintances. People who knew my father, but friends?" She shook her head. "My whole life there was narrow. Take care, Father. Mind the store. Keep my head down and don't make trouble." She drank from the canteen, the water almost too warm to be refreshing. "I didn't realize how small I'd made myself until I left." Elias nodded, staring out at the valley. "I came out here after my wife died. Seemed like I needed distance from everything that reminded me of her. Thought if I worked hard enough, built something new, maybe I could—" He trailed off. Naomi waited. He'd never mentioned a wife before. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "Died in childbirth. Baby didn't make it either. Boy. We'd already picked out a name, Samuel, after her father." He was quiet for a moment. "That was 4 years ago. Feels like longer." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." He stood, brushing hay from his pants. "Anyway, that's why I'm out here. Building something I don't have to share memories with." They went back to work, but something had shifted. The silence felt different now, weighted with things understood but not spoken. That night, Naomi lay in her bunk thinking about Sarah and the baby who'd never drawn breath, thinking about the wife Thomas Brennan had mentioned so casually, wielding her existence like a weapon, thinking about all the ways people carried loss and what they did with it afterward. Some people, like Thomas, turned mean, found ways to inflict their pain on others. Elias had come to the mountains and built a life with his hands. Naomi wasn't sure what she was building yet, but she was starting to think it might be something worth keeping. August brought thunderstorms that rolled through the valley with biblical fury. Lightning struck close enough to make the hair on Naomi's arms stand up. Rain came in sheets, turning the ground to mud and the creeks to roaring torrents. They lost part of the garden to flooding. The squash plants washed away overnight, leaving bare patches where green had been. "Can't control the weather," Elias said, surveying the damage. "Just have to adapt." They replanted when they could and reinforced the remaining beds with rocks to channel the water. It was frustrating work, undoing what they'd already done, but Naomi was learning that ranch life meant accepting setbacks without complaint. Nature didn't care about your plans. On a rare calm evening, Elias suggested they ride out to check on the cattle in the upper pasture. Naomi had gotten more comfortable on horseback over the summer. Not skilled, exactly, but competent enough to stay in the saddle. They took Molly and Red following a narrow trail that wound up through the timber. The upper pasture was actually a natural meadow, ringed by pines and fed by a spring that never ran dry. The cattle grazed contentedly, fat on good grass. Everything looked fine. "Sometimes I just like to see it," Elias said, dismounting. "Make sure it's all real." Naomi slid down from Molly, grateful for solid ground. The meadow was beautiful in the late afternoon light, gold and green and peaceful. For a moment, she let herself just stand there, breathing in the smell of pine and grass. "It's different up here," she said, quieter. "That's why I like it." Elias walked to the edge of the meadow, looking out at the mountains. "When everything else is chaos, at least this stays the same." Naomi joined him. From this vantage point, she could see for miles, valleys and ridges stretching away into blue distance. Somewhere out there was Stillwater Junction, and beyond that Pennsylvania, and beyond that all the versions of herself she'd left behind. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "leaving everything?" "Every day." He said it without hesitation. "But I regret staying in one place and dying slowly even more. At least out here, if I fail, it's my own doing." They stood there for a while, not talking, just watching the light change. Naomi was acutely aware of Elias beside her, the warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It stirred something in her that she'd been trying to ignore for weeks now. She told herself it was just gratitude. He'd helped her when no one else would, given her work and shelter, and treated her like an equal. Of course she felt grateful, but this wasn't gratitude. The ride back was quiet. They reached the homestead as dusk was settling in, purple shadows pooling in the low places. After they'd tended the horses, Elias paused at the barn door. "Naomi?" She turned. "Yes?" He seemed to struggle with something, then shook his head. "Nothing. Get some rest. Tomorrow we need to start thinking about the slaughter." The slaughter. Right. They'd been fattening one of the pigs all summer, and fall was coming. Time to turn livestock into winter provisions. Naomi went to the bunkhouse, but sleep was elusive. She kept thinking about the way Elias had looked at her in the meadow, or maybe the way she'd wanted him to look at her. It was dangerous territory. She'd come here running from one disaster. The last thing she needed was to create another. September arrived with cool mornings and the first hint of color in the aspen leaves. The garden was producing heavily now. More vegetables than two people could eat fresh. Naomi spent her evenings canning, processing jars of beans and tomatoes and pickles to line the root cellar shelves. Elias helped when he could, though he admitted he was useless with the finer points of preserving food. "Sarah used to do all this," he said, watching Naomi work. "She had a system. Everything labeled and dated and organized. I've been eating through her preserves for 4 years. Finally ran out last winter." "Is that why you needed help? Running out of food?" "Part of it." He leaned against the doorframe. "Mostly I just got tired of doing everything alone. Starts to feel pointless after a while. All that work for just one person." Naomi sealed another jar, the lid popping satisfyingly as it sealed. "Doesn't feel pointless now?" "No, now it feels like we're building something that'll last beyond next winter. That matters." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should be. Later that week, they rode into Stillwater Junction for supplies. It was Naomi's first time back since leaving, and she felt her stomach tighten as the town came into view. "You don't have to come in," Elias said, reading her tension. "I can handle the provisioning." "No, I'm not hiding." She climbed down from the wagon with her chin up and her shoulders back. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She'd earned her place in this valley through sweat and blood and work that would break most of them. The general store was busy. Porter, the owner, nodded at Elias and then did a double take when he saw Naomi. "Miss Carter, I barely recognized you." Naomi knew what he meant. She'd looked in a mirror recently, really looked. The soft, pale woman who'd stepped off the train was gone. In her place was someone leaner, harder, burned brown by the sun. Her hands were scarred and calloused. Her hair, once carefully pinned, was pulled back in a simple braid. She looked like she belonged here. "Mr. Porter," she said evenly, "we need flour, sugar, coffee, and salt. Also ammunition if you have any." While Porter gathered their order, other customers filtered in. Naomi recognized a few faces from that first awful day. They recognized her too, and their reactions ranged from surprise to something that might have been respect. Thomas Brennan's wife Clara was there, buying fabric. She looked Naomi up and down, then sniffed and turned away. "Heard you're working for Elias Vance," she said to no one in particular, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Living out there in the bunkhouse. Convenient arrangement." Naomi felt heat rise in her face, but Elias spoke before she could. "Mrs. Brennan." His voice was cold as January. "Miss Carter is my business partner. She's worked harder in 6 months than most men do in a year. I'd appreciate you keeping your speculation to yourself." Clara's face went red. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you do." Elias turned back to Porter. "That everything?" "Just about. Let me tally it up." The store had gone quiet. Clara gathered her purchases and swept out, her skirt swishing indignation. The other customers suddenly found their own business very interesting. Outside, loading the wagon, Naomi said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. What she implied was—" "I know what she implied. I don't care." Naomi hefted a sack of flour into the wagon bed. "People like her will always find something to talk about. Let them." Elias studied her for a moment. "You've changed." "Is that bad?" "No, it's good. You're tougher now, harder to hurt." They finished loading in silence and headed back to the homestead. But Naomi couldn't stop thinking about what Clara had said. Living out there in the bunkhouse. Convenient arrangement. The insinuation was clear. Impropriety. A woman living alone with a man, no matter how separate their sleeping quarters, would always raise eyebrows. And if she was being honest with herself, Clara's speculation wasn't entirely unfounded. Naomi had been fighting her growing feelings for Elias for weeks now. The way her heart jumped when he smiled. The way she found excuses to work near him. The way she'd started to imagine what it might be like if their partnership became something more. But wanting something didn't make it wise. And Naomi had already gambled everything on wanting once before. October brought the first hard frost. They woke one morning to find the world transformed, every blade of grass etched in white. The garden plants that hadn't been harvested yet blackened and died. Winter was announcing its intentions. They worked frantically to finish preparations. The last of the vegetables came in and got processed. They slaughtered the pig, brutal work that left Naomi shaking but determined not to show it. The meat got salted, smoked, and stored. They repaired the barn roof one final time, reinforcing it against snow they knew was coming. Every evening they sat at Elias's table and went over their supplies, calculating what they had against what they'd need. It was always close. Too close. "We'll make it," Elias said, but Naomi could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. "What happens if we don't?" "We make it anyway. No choice." November was when things shifted again. They were working on the last major project before winter closed in, cutting and splitting enough firewood to see them through until spring. It was exhausting work, and they fell into a rhythm. Elias felling the trees, Naomi trimming branches and splitting the smaller logs. On a particularly cold afternoon working near the tree line, Naomi misjudged a swing. The axe glanced off the log and bit into her leg just above the boot. The pain was instant and shocking. She stumbled backward, dropping the axe, and looked down to see blood already soaking through her pants. "Elias!" He was there in seconds, his face going pale when he saw the blood. "How bad?" "I don't know." Her voice shook. "It hurts." He got her to the ground, pulled out his knife, and cut away the fabric. The wound was ugly, maybe 3 inches long, deep enough to worry about, but not spurting. Not an artery, then. That was something. "We need to get you back to the house," Elias said. His hands were steady, but his voice was tight. "Can you stand?" She could, barely. He got his shoulder under hers and half carried her down the slope to where they'd left the horses. Getting her into the saddle was agony. and the ride back was worse. Every step Molly took sent fresh waves of pain up Naomi's leg. At the house, Elias helped her inside and onto his bed, the only real bed on the property. He brought hot water, clean cloth, and a bottle of whiskey. "This is going to hurt," he said. "Everything already hurts." He cleaned the wound, and Naomi bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming. Then came the whiskey, poured directly into the cut, and she couldn't help the cry that escaped her. "I'm sorry," Elias said. "I'm sorry." He stitched the wound closed with steady hands, pulling the edges together with careful precision. Naomi watched him work, seeing the concentration on his face, the care in his movements. When it was done, he bandaged her leg and sat back. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days. Let it start healing before you put weight on it." "We don't have time for me to be useless." "You're not useless. You're injured. There's a difference." He met her eyes. "I can finish the wood. You just focus on not bleeding to death." That night, Elias insisted she stay in the house rather than trying to navigate to the bunkhouse. He took the bench near the fireplace, giving her his bed. "This is ridiculous," Naomi said. "It's your bed. And you're the one who got hurt. Don't argue." She was too tired and in too much pain to argue anyway. She lay in Elias's bed, the first real mattress she'd slept on in months, and stared at the ceiling. The room smelled like him, like wood smoke and leather and something she couldn't quite name. Through the doorway, she could see him on the bench, trying to get comfortable. He was too tall for it, his feet hanging off the end. "Elias? Yeah? Thank you for taking care of me." A pause. "You'd do the same for me." "Would I? I don't know how to stitch wounds." "You'd figure it out. That's what you do. You figure things out." Naomi closed her eyes, feeling something warm unfold in her chest. It was dangerous, this warmth. Dangerous to let herself feel it, to let herself imagine it might mean something. But she was so tired of being afraid. The next few days were strange. Naomi couldn't do much with her leg healing, so she took over the indoor tasks: cooking, mending, organizing supplies. Elias finished the firewood alone, coming back each evening exhausted but refusing to complain. They fell into a new routine: meals together at the table, evenings by the fireplace, Naomi mending while Elias worked on tack or tools. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. One evening, watching the fire, Elias said, "I've been thinking." Naomi looked up from the shirt she was patching. "About?" "About Clara Brennan and her comments. About what people in town will say." He shifted uncomfortably. "About propriety and reputation and all that." Naomi's heart began to pound. And I think, if you're agreeable, we should consider making our arrangement more formal." The words hung in the air. Naomi couldn't quite process them. "Formal how?" she asked carefully. Elias stood, paced to the window, looked out at the darkness. "I'm making a hash of this. What I'm trying to say is," he turned to face her, "I've come to care for you, Naomi. More than I probably should, more than I meant to. And I know it's complicated, and I know you came here running from one bad situation, and the last thing I want is to put you in another one. But if there was any chance you might feel..." He trailed off, looking miserable. Naomi set down her mending. Her leg throbbed as she stood, but she needed to be on her feet for this, needed to meet him as an equal. "What are you asking me, Elias?" "I'm asking if you'd consider marriage, a real partnership, not just business. I know it's not romantic, and I know I'm not offering much, just a hardscrabble ranch and more work than any person should have to do. But I can promise you honesty. I can promise you respect. And I can promise you that I'll never make you feel small or worthless or like you're anything less than essential." Naomi's throat tightened. This was nothing like Thomas's flowery letters. No poetry about sunsets or destiny, just a quiet man offering what he actually had to give. And it terrified her. "I need to think," she said. Something flickered across Elias's face, hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but he nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He went outside, probably to check on the animals, giving her space. Naomi sank back onto the chair, her leg protesting. Marriage. To Elias. 6 months ago, she'd been desperate enough to travel 1,000 miles for the promise of exactly this. But that had been different. That had been about survival, about escaping a life that was slowly suffocating her. This was about choosing, actually choosing, with full knowledge of what she was getting into, and that made it infinitely more frightening. Because if she said yes and it went wrong, she'd have no one to blame but herself. No cruel joke to point to, no deception to cite as the reason for her failure. It would just be her making the wrong choice, again. But if she said no because she was afraid, what did that make her? Naomi sat by the fire long into the night thinking about trust and risk and whether anything worth having ever came without the possibility of loss. About Elias's steady hands stitching her wound, about 6 months of honest work and honest company, about whether she could bear to gamble on hope one more time. The next morning, she found him in the barn, forking hay to the cattle. "Yes," she said. He turned, and for a moment he just stared at her. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you, if the offer still stands." Elias set down the pitchfork and crossed to where she stood. He didn't try to touch her, didn't sweep her into his arms like the novels she'd read as a girl. He just looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "The offer stands. Always will, far as I'm concerned." "I'm scared," Naomi admitted, "of trusting this, of letting myself want something and having it turn into another disaster." "I'm scared too," Elias said quietly. "I lost Sarah, lost the baby, lost the life I thought I'd have. Starting over with you means risking that kind of pain again." "Then why do it?" "Because the alternative is worse. Being alone forever, never taking a chance on something good just because something bad happened before. That's not living. That's just waiting to die." Naomi felt tears prick her eyes. "What if I'm not good at this? Being a wife, I mean. I don't know how to—" "Neither do I, being a husband to you specifically. But we'll figure it out, same as we figured out everything else." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand. "We've already got the hard part down. We work well together. The rest we'll learn." His hand was warm and calloused, familiar from months of working side by side. Naomi squeezed it, letting herself believe just for a moment that this might actually work. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you want. We'll need to go to town, find whoever handles these things. Make it legal and proper." "Before winter?" "If that's what you want." Naomi thought about Clara Brennan's insinuations, about her own growing feelings that she'd been trying so hard to suppress, about the long winter ahead when they'd be snowed in together with nowhere to hide. "Yes," she said. "Before winter." They rode to Stillwater Junction a week later on a cold November morning that threatened snow. Naomi wore her best dress, the blue wool she'd arrived in, now faded and patched but still serviceable. Elias wore a clean shirt and his only jacket. The man who handled marriages was the justice of the peace, a tired-looking fellow named Henderson, who operated out of a small office above the general store. He looked surprised to see them. "You're sure about this?" he asked Naomi, not unkindly. "No family to consult? No one to stand with you?" "I'm sure," Naomi said firmly. Henderson shrugged and pulled out the necessary papers. "I'll need 2 witnesses." They found them in the general store, Porter and his eldest son, both willing enough to come upstairs and watch 2 people make promises to each other. The ceremony took maybe 5 minutes. Henderson read the words, Elias and Naomi repeated them, and that was it. Married. Legal and binding. Afterward, signing the register, Naomi's hand shook slightly. Elias noticed and covered her hand with his. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I think so. It just feels permanent." "It is permanent. That's the point." He smiled just a little. "But if you want to run, now's the time. Before we head back to the ranch and I make you help finish that fence in the north pasture." Despite everything, Naomi laughed. "Romantic." "I'm practical. You knew that when you married me." They rode back to the homestead as husband and wife, and Naomi tried to process what had just happened. She'd married a man she'd known for 6 months, a quiet, serious man who made no promises about love or happiness, only about honesty and respect. It should have felt like settling, like giving up on something better. Instead, it felt like the first completely honest thing she'd done in her entire life. That night, in the house they now officially shared, Elias made dinner while Naomi set the table. It wasn't different from 100 other evenings, except that it was. Everything meant something more now. After they ate, Elias cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about sleeping arrangements." Here it was, the part they'd been dancing around. Naomi felt her heart rate pick up. "We're married now," Elias continued, looking uncomfortable. "Which means, traditionally, but I don't want you to feel pressured. If you'd rather keep things as they've been, with you in the bunkhouse, that's fine. Or if you want to move into the house but keep separate beds, that's fine too. I just want you to know." He stopped, started again. "I want you to know that you're safe here, always, no matter what." Naomi studied him across the table. This man who'd taken her in when she had nothing, who'd taught her to work the land and trust her own strength, who'd proposed marriage not with pretty words but with promises he could actually keep. "I don't want to sleep in the bunkhouse anymore," she said. Something shifted in Elias's expression. "All right. But I'm still scared. Of this. Of intimacy. Of getting it wrong. So am I." He reached across the table and she took his hand. "So we'll take it slow. Figure it out together. No rush, no pressure. Just us. Working out how to be married the same way we worked out everything else." That night, Naomi moved her things from the bunkhouse into the main house, into Elias's room, their room now. They lay in the same bed, not quite touching, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence. "This is strange," Naomi whispered into the darkness. "Yeah." A pause. "Good strange or bad strange?" "I'm not sure yet." Elias's hand found hers in the dark, laced their fingers together. "We've got time to figure it out." And lying there, holding the hand of the man who was now her husband, Naomi let herself hope. Really hope, without the armor of cynicism or the safety of low expectations. It was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. But it was also, she was beginning to think, worth the risk. The first snow came 3 days after the wedding, gentle at first, then building into something that meant business. Naomi woke to find the world erased, everything buried under 2 feet of white that was still falling. Elias was already up, stoking the fire. "Winter's here," he said, looking out the window. "Early this year." They spent that day and the next digging out paths to the barn, the chicken coop, the root cellar. The work was exhausting, and the snow kept coming. By the 3rd day they were truly snowed in, the road to town completely impassable, the valley isolated from everything. Naomi had known it was coming, had prepared for it mentally, but knowing and experiencing were different things. The silence was profound. No sounds except wind, the creak of the house settling, the occasional lowing of cattle in the barn. Just the 2 of them and miles of empty white. The first week was awkward. They were still learning how to be married, how to exist in the same space as husband and wife rather than business partners. Small things became magnified. The way Elias left his boots by the door, the way Naomi organized the shelves, the 100 tiny adjustments required when 2 people tried to build a shared life. One morning, making breakfast, they collided in the narrow space between the table and the stove. Elias reached for the coffee pot. At the same moment, Naomi turned with the pan, and they bumped into each other hard enough that she nearly dropped everything. "Sorry," he said, backing up. "No, I'm sorry. I should have. It's fine. We just need to..." He gestured vaguely. "Figure out a system. They stood there, both feeling foolish, until Naomi started laughing. Not polite laughter, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of it all. "What?" Elias asked, but he was almost smiling. "We've worked side by side for 6 months, hundreds of hours. We can fell trees and build fences and slaughter pigs together without a problem. But making breakfast in a small kitchen defeats us. When you put it that way, it does seem ridiculous. It is ridiculous. We're ridiculous." She set down the pan and looked at him. "But I think that's all right. We're allowed to be ridiculous while we figure this out." Something relaxed in Elias's shoulders. "Yeah, I guess we are." After that, things got easier. Not perfect. Nothing about their life would ever be perfect, but easier. They developed rhythms. Elias handled the morning fire and the heavy lifting. Naomi managed the cooking and the indoor organizing. They did the animal care together, bundling up against the cold to break ice in water troughs and haul hay to hungry cattle. The evenings were the best part. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire, Elias whittling or mending tack, Naomi sewing or reading aloud from one of her books. He'd never been much of a reader, but he listened while she worked through her small library, Shakespeare, Dickens, a battered copy of Jane Eyre. "I don't understand half of what they're saying," he admitted one night, "but I like hearing you read." Even when I stumble over the words? Especially then, reminds me you're real, not some character in a story. December brought colder temperatures and shorter days. The snow kept accumulating, banking against the house until they had to dig out the windows to let in light. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate, and Elias fretted over whether they'd have enough. "We'll make it," Naomi said, echoing his words from months ago. "You don't know that. Neither do you, but worrying won't split more wood or make winter shorter." He looked at her, something like admiration in his eyes. "When did you get so practical?" "I learned from the best." The isolation did strange things to time. Days blurred together. Without the structure of varied work, everything was just survival now, keeping warm and fed. It was easy to lose track. Naomi started marking the days on a piece of paper, making small notations. Snow, clear, more snow. Fixed harness. Bessie gave less milk, might be getting old. Christmas came and went, unremarked except that Naomi made a special dinner using some of their precious preserved venison. They didn't have gifts to exchange, didn't have decorations or ceremony, just a better-than-usual meal and the acknowledgement that they'd made it halfway through winter. "Next year will be different," Elias said over dinner. "We'll plan for it. Make it feel less like just another day. Next year." The assumption of continuity, of them still being here, still being together. It should have felt presumptuous, but instead it felt like hope. That night, lying in bed, Naomi said, "I'm glad I'm here. With you. Instead of alone in some boarding house somewhere, trying to survive on my own." Elias pulled her closer. They'd grown more comfortable with physical affection over the weeks. Nothing dramatic, just small touches. Falling asleep in each other's arms. "I'm glad you're here too. Can't imagine doing this alone anymore." "Did you really manage it alone for 3 years?" "Barely. There were times I thought about giving up, selling the place and moving to California or somewhere easier." He was quiet for a moment. "What stopped me was stubbornness more than anything else. Couldn't stand the idea of admitting defeat." "I understand that." "I know you do. It's one of the things He stopped. "One of the things you..." "What?" "One of the things I love about you." The words fell into the darkness between them. Naomi's heart stuttered. They'd been married 2 months, but neither had said those words yet. They'd been too careful, too afraid of presuming too much. "Elias, you don't have to say it back. I just wanted you to know. You're not just my partner or my wife. You matter. More than I thought anyone would ever matter again." Naomi turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely see his features in the dark. "I love you too. I didn't want to. I was so afraid of it. But I do." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, and something shifted between them. The marriage stopped being just practical and became something more, something neither of them had quite dared to hope for. January was brutal, the coldest month Naomi had ever experienced, with temperatures that made exposed skin burn and breathing painful. They stayed inside as much as possible, venturing out only for essential chores. One afternoon, coming back from the barn, Elias's face was white with cold, his lips blue. "You're frozen," Naomi said, alarmed. She made him sit by the fire, brought him coffee, rubbed his hands between hers to restore circulation. "I'm fine," he protested, but his teeth were chattering. "You're not fine. You're half frozen." She kept rubbing his hands, watching color slowly return. "We need to be more careful. One of us dying of cold won't help anything." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm serious, Elias." "I know. You're right. Sometimes I forget I'm not alone anymore. Forget that someone would notice if I didn't come back." The words hit harder than he probably meant them to. Naomi thought about those 3 years he'd spent alone. Nobody to notice or care if he got hurt or sick or just gave up. "Well, someone would notice now, so don't make me have to come looking for your frozen corpse." Romantic. Practical. "You taught me that?" Despite the cold and the isolation, they found ways to make life bearable. Elias taught Naomi to play chess using a set he'd carved from wood years ago. She was terrible at it, but he was patient, showing her strategies and never getting frustrated when she made obviously bad moves. She taught him to bake bread, which he'd been doing poorly for years. Under her instruction, his loaves actually rose and didn't come out tasting like salted rocks. "This is edible," he said, surprised, holding up a slice. Don't sound so shocked. You just needed someone to explain the process properly. Sarah tried. I never got the hang of it. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah's name in weeks. Naomi waited to see if he'd say more. She'd like you, I think, Elias continued, staring at the bread. She'd be glad I'm not alone anymore. She worried about that. In those last hours, she kept saying she was sorry for leaving me. That must have been hard to hear. It was. Still is, thinking about it. He looked at Naomi. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Time helps. And having you here helps more than I can say. February brought a brief thaw, then more snow. Their supplies were holding, but just barely. The flour was running low, and they'd already started rationing coffee. We might need to slaughter another chicken, Elias said, counting what they had left. We need the eggs more than the meat. We need both. But you're right. We'll wait as long as we can. They killed one of the older hens that had stopped laying, and Naomi made it last for days. Stew, then soup, then stock. Nothing wasted, every scrap used. The monotony of winter was wearing on both of them. Small irritations became arguments. Elias snapped at her for moving his tools. She snapped back about him tracking snow inside. They went to bed angry more than once, lying stiffly on opposite sides of the mattress. But they always made up, usually by morning, sometimes sooner. Elias would reach for her hand in the dark, or she'd apologize for overreacting, and they'd remember why they were doing this. We're not going to make it through every winter perfectly, Naomi said one night after a particularly stupid fight about firewood. We'll argue and get on each other's nerves. That's just what happens when you trap two people in a small house for months. I know, I just hate fighting with you. I hate it too. But it doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means we're human. March arrived with winds that howled around the house and stripped away snow in uneven patches. The temperature rose slightly, enough to give hope that winter might eventually end. One morning, Naomi woke feeling strange, vaguely nauseous, more tired than usual. She chalked it up to the monotony of their diet, the staleness of being indoors for so long. But the nausea persisted, and when she missed her monthly courses, she knew. She waited a week to be sure, then another week trying to figure out how to tell Elias. They'd been careful, but not that careful, and she'd known this was a possibility. Still, the reality of it was overwhelming. Finally, one evening after dinner, she just said it. I'm pregnant. Elias had been drinking coffee. He set the cup down slowly. Are you sure? As sure as I can be without a doctor. All the signs are there. He stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the snow. Naomi's stomach clenched. Was he angry? Afraid? Regretting everything? When he turned back, there were tears on his face. I didn't think I'd get another chance at this. After losing Sarah and the baby, I thought... He wiped his eyes roughly. I'm scared, Naomi. I'm terrified of losing you the same way. She went to him, took his hands. I'm scared too. But we'll face it together, and I'm not Sarah. Different woman, different pregnancy. We can't borrow trouble from the past. I know, you're right. He pulled her close, held her tight. I can't lose you. I can't. You won't. I'm tougher than I look, remember? He laughed, shaky but genuine. Yeah, you are. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, processing this new reality. A baby. Coming sometime in the fall, by Naomi's calculations. We'll need supplies, Elias said, shifting into practical mode. Things for the baby, things for you. Medicine, in case of complications. We can't get to town until the snow melts. Then as soon as it does, we go. Stock up on everything we might need. The pregnancy changed things. Elias became almost obsessively protective, trying to stop Naomi from doing any heavy work. She had to remind him repeatedly that she was pregnant, not broken. Women have been having babies and working farms for thousands of years, she said, when he tried to take over all the barn chores. I can still feed the chickens. But what if you fall? What if I go crazy from being treated like an invalid? She softened her tone. I appreciate the concern, but I need to keep working. It's what keeps me sane. They compromised. She did the lighter tasks. He handled anything that required heavy lifting or exposed her to potential danger. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The nausea was worst in the mornings. Naomi would wake feeling like the world was tilting, and the smell of coffee, which she'd always loved, became unbearable. Elias started making tea instead, something bland that didn't turn her stomach. "This is awful," she said one morning, sipping the weak brew. "I know, but it's better than you being sick." Is it, though? Despite the discomfort, there was something miraculous about it, too. A life growing inside her. Proof that she and Elias had created something beyond just survival. The homestead would outlast them now, passed down to this child and maybe children after that. April finally brought real warmth. The snow melted rapidly, turning everything to mud. The creek swelled with runoff, and the valley transformed from white to brown to the first hints of green. They could leave the homestead again, finally, after months of isolation. "We need to make a list," Naomi said. "Everything we'll need for the baby, plus the usual supplies." The list grew long: cloth for diapers and baby clothes, medicine, more flour and sugar, seeds for the garden, a cradle. Elias said he could build one, but they'd need proper wood. The expenses added up quickly. "We don't have enough money," Elias said, looking at the numbers. "Even selling some cattle, we'll be short. Then we make do with less. We've done it before." They sold 3 head of cattle to a rancher north of Stillwater, getting less than Elias hoped for, but more than he feared. With the money, they made the trip to town, the wagon loaded with their carefully prioritized list. Stillwater Junction looked different in spring, or maybe Naomi was different, and that changed how she saw it. The town that had once seemed like the site of her greatest humiliation now just looked small and ordinary. They provisioned carefully, Naomi bargaining with Porter over prices while Elias loaded the wagon. She'd gotten good at this, at making every dollar stretch. Clara Brennan walked past while they were loading and stopped when she saw Naomi's growing belly. "Well," she said, her voice carrying, "that didn't take long." Naomi looked at her flatly. "Is there something you need, Mrs. Brennan? Or are you just spreading charm wherever you go?" Clara's face reddened. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I'm sure you do. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." She turned her back on Clara, dismissing her. Elias caught her eye and grinned. "That was satisfying to watch," he said quietly. "She's not worth the energy to be upset over." They finished loading and headed back to the homestead. The road was still muddy, making the trip slower than usual, but Naomi didn't mind. Being out in the world again, seeing the valley wake up from winter, felt like emerging from a cave. Back home, they unpacked and took stock. They'd spent almost all their money, but they had what they needed. Barely, but enough. "We'll make it work," Naomi said, organizing the supplies in the root cellar. "We always do." May brought the garden back to life. Naomi planted with extra care this year, knowing that by harvest time she'd be heavily pregnant or newly delivered. They needed the food, needed a successful growing season more than ever. She was showing clearly now, her belly rounding out under her dresses. Elias had let out the seams as much as possible, but she was running out of clothes that fit. "I look like I swallowed a watermelon," she said one morning, trying to button a dress that no longer closed. "You look like you're carrying our child. That's different." "You're obligated to say that." "Doesn't make it less true." The pregnancy was harder than she'd expected. Not the nausea, which had mostly passed, but the exhaustion, the aches, the way her body didn't quite feel like her own anymore. She kept working, but slower, having to rest more often. One afternoon, weeding the garden, she felt the baby move for the first time. A flutter, like a fish turning in her belly. She sat back on her heels, hand pressed to her stomach, amazed. "Elias!" He came running, alarmed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. The baby moved. Here, give me your hand." She placed his palm on her belly and waited. After a moment, there it was again, that small, miraculous flutter. Elias's face transformed. That's really our baby, letting us know it's in there." He kept his hand on her stomach, waiting for more movement. "Hello?" he said quietly. "Hello, little one. We're your parents, and we're waiting for you." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Watching Elias talk to their unborn child, seeing the tenderness in his face, she felt something settle in her chest. This was real. This family they were building was real and solid and worth every risk she'd taken. June brought the demanding work of summer again, but Naomi had to step back from most of it. Her belly was too large, her balance too uncertain for the heavy labor. She focused on the garden and the chickens, letting Elias handle the rest. He hired a drifter passing through to help with the haying, paying him in meals and a few dollars they could barely spare. The extra hands made the difference, getting the work done before Naomi got too close to her time. July was hot and miserable. Naomi felt huge, ungainly, constantly uncomfortable. Sleep was difficult. Her back ached constantly, and she had to stop every task multiple times to rest. "I'm useless," she said one evening, frustrated with her own limitations. "You're growing a human being. That's the opposite of useless." "I can't help with the work." "You're doing different work. Harder work, probably." He rubbed her shoulders, trying to ease the tension there. "Just a few more weeks, and then we'll have a baby. And then you'll be doing even harder work for the next 18 years. That's not comforting. Wasn't meant to be, just honest." She appreciated the honesty, appreciated that he didn't try to make it sound easier than it would be. They were in this together, eyes open, no illusions. August arrived with thunderstorms and the knowledge that the baby would come soon. Naomi made final preparations. Diapers sewn and washed, the cradle Elias had built positioned near their bed, supplies gathered for the birth. They'd have to manage it themselves. No doctor, no midwife. The nearest one was in Big Timber, too far to reach in time when labor started. Elias had a book on childbirth that he'd bought in town, and they'd read it cover to cover multiple times. "I'm terrified," Naomi admitted one night. "What if something goes wrong? Then we handle it, same as we handle everything else." "This is different. This is life and death." "I know." He pulled her close, careful of her belly. "But you're strong, Naomi. Stronger than anyone I've ever known. If anyone can do this, you can." She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because ready or not, the baby was coming. And soon they'd find out if all their building, all their work and hope and fear could withstand this final test. Labor started on a Tuesday morning in late August, 2 weeks earlier than Naomi had calculated. She woke before dawn with a dull ache in her lower back, different from the usual pregnancy discomfort. She lay still for a moment, trying to decide if this was real or just another false alarm. Then the first real contraction hit, and she knew. "Elias," she said, gripping his arm, "it's time." He was awake instantly, sitting up. In the dim pre-dawn light, she could see fear flash across his face before he locked it down. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He got out of bed, started moving with purpose. Lit the lamps, built up the fire, brought water to boil. They'd planned for this, rehearsed what needed to happen, but now that it was real, everything felt insufficient. The contractions came irregularly at first, 20 minutes apart, then 15, then 10. Naomi tried to keep moving, walking circles around the small house, because the book had said movement helped. But each wave of pain stopped her in her tracks, forcing her to lean against whatever was nearest and breathe through it. "How bad is it?" Elias asked, hovering nearby. "Bad enough," she managed a weak smile. "But not unbearable yet." Yet being the operative word. By midday, the contractions were 5 minutes apart, and intense enough that Naomi couldn't talk through them. Elias had read the book 3 more times, trying to prepare himself for what came next. His hands shook as he arranged the supplies they'd gathered. Clean linens, boiled water, the knife they'd sterilized for cutting the cord. "What if I can't do this?" he said, more to himself than to her. "You can." Naomi gripped his hand as another contraction built. "You have to. There's no one else." The afternoon blurred into a haze of pain. Naomi had thought she understood what hard work felt like. Months of ranch labor had taught her about exhaustion and pushing her body past its limits. But this was different. This was her body doing something she had no control over, a force that wouldn't stop no matter how tired she got. Between contractions, she rested on the bed they'd prepared with extra linens. Elias wiped her face with a cool cloth, gave her water when she could drink it. "Tell me something," she said during a brief respite. "Distract me." "What do you want to hear?" "Anything. Just talk." So he talked. Told her about the first time he'd come to this valley, how empty and harsh it had seemed. Told her about building the house, one log at a time, not knowing if he'd make it through the first winter. Told her about the day she'd stepped off that train, how something in him had recognized something in her. That same stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting made sense. "I knew you'd make it," he said. "Even when you were standing there with your carpet bag, looking like the world had just ended. I knew you had it in you." "You couldn't have known that." "Maybe not, but I hoped. And hoping was enough to make me offer you work. The pain was getting worse. Naomi could feel her body changing, opening, preparing for what came next. She wanted to scream, wanted to beg for it to stop, but she clenched her teeth and endured. Evening came. The light through the windows shifted from gold to orange to purple. Elias lit more lamps, creating a warm glow that would have been peaceful under any other circumstances. "I need to check," he said, his voice uncertain. "The book says I need to see how far along you are." Naomi nodded, beyond modesty or embarrassment. He checked, and when he looked up, his face was pale. "I can see the baby's head. You're close." Close. The word should have been encouraging, but all Naomi felt was fear. This was the dangerous part, the part that had killed Sarah, the part where everything could go wrong in 100 different ways. "I'm scared," she said. "I know, me too." He positioned himself where he needed to be, hands ready. "But you can do this, Naomi. Your body knows what to do." The next contraction was overwhelming. Naomi felt the urge to push, and she bore down with everything she had. It felt like being torn apart from the inside. "Good," Elias said. "That's good. Again, on the next one." Again and again and again, time lost meaning. There was only pain and effort and the desperate need to get this baby out. Naomi pushed until she thought she'd break, until she couldn't imagine finding the strength for one more contraction. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do this anymore." "You are doing it. The head's almost out. One more big push." She didn't know where she found the strength. Maybe from all those months of ranch work, all those days of refusing to quit when her body screamed at her to stop. Maybe from something deeper, some reserve she hadn't known existed. She pushed, and the baby came into the world in a rush of blood and fluid, wailing immediately. "It's a girl," Elias said, his voice cracking. "We have a daughter." He placed the baby on Naomi's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature who was screaming her displeasure at this new cold world. She was perfect. Fingers and toes, a shock of dark hair, eyes squeezed shut against the lamplight. "Hello," Naomi whispered, touching her daughter's cheek. "Hello, little one. I'm your mother." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of her voice. Those tiny eyes opened, unfocused but searching. Elias was crying openly now, dealing with the afterbirth and cord with shaking hands but managing it. When everything was done, when mother and baby were as cleaned up as they could be, he sat on the edge of the bed and just stared. "She's really here," he said. "She's really alive. We're both alive." Naomi felt exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, but also strangely energized. "We did it." "You did it. I just caught." They named her Clara, not after Mrs. Brennan, but after Naomi's mother, dead these 10 years. Clara Grace Vance, born August 23, 1884, 7 pounds and healthy. The first few days were brutal. Naomi's body ached everywhere, and the baby needed constant attention. Nursing hurt, sleep was impossible, and there were moments when Naomi wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The baby cried for reasons Naomi couldn't fathom, changed her, fed her, held her, and still she cried. "What am I doing wrong?" Naomi asked Elias on the third day, tears streaming down her face while Clara wailed in her arms. "Nothing. Babies cry. It's what they do." He took the baby, walked her around the room, bouncing gently. "We just have to figure out what she needs." What Clara needed, apparently, was motion. If someone was walking her or rocking her, she settled. The moment they stopped, she screamed. Naomi and Elias took turns, pacing the floor at all hours, learning this tiny person's preferences. "She's stubborn," Elias said one night, around 3 in the morning. "Wonder where she gets that. Definitely from you." Definitely from both of us. But slowly, painfully, they figured it out. Learned Clara's different cries, her rhythms, what soothed her and what set her off. Naomi's body healed. The exhaustion became more manageable. And one morning, about 2 weeks after the birth, Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her whole face. "Did you see that?" Naomi asked, delighted. "I saw. She knows who we are." September brought cooler weather and the return of work that couldn't be postponed. The garden needed harvesting, the animals needed tending, and they'd lost 2 weeks of productivity to the birth and recovery. Naomi strapped Clara to her chest with a length of cloth. The baby nested against her while she picked vegetables. It was awkward, but it worked. Clara seemed content being close, and Naomi could get things done. "You're not supposed to be working this hard yet," Elias said, finding her in the garden. "The vegetables don't care about my recovery schedule. They're ripe now. At least let me carry the baskets." They worked together, Elias doing the heavy lifting while Naomi directed and managed what she could with a baby strapped to her. It wasn't efficient, but it got done. October brought their first trip to town as a family. They needed supplies and wanted to register Clara's birth officially. The wagon ride was longer with frequent stops to feed the baby, but they made it. Stillwater Junction looked the same as always, small, dusty, unremarkable. But when Naomi climbed down from the wagon with Clara in her arms, people stared. She'd changed since her last visit. Thinner from the pregnancy and birth, harder from the work, but there was something else too. A confidence that hadn't been there before. She stood straighter, met people's eyes without flinching. Porter came out of the general store when he saw them. "Well, I'll be. Heard you had a baby. Girl, wasn't it?" "Her name's Clara." Naomi shifted the baby to show her off. 3 weeks old. "She's a beauty. Got your looks and probably her daddy's stubbornness." Other people gathered, curious. Even Daniel Brennan came out from his hotel, smiling when he saw the baby. "Congratulations," he said. "Both of you. It's good to see things working out." Clara Brennan appeared from the general store, her expression sour. She looked at Naomi, at the baby, at the way Elias stood protectively close. Something flickered across her face. Envy, maybe, or just the bitter knowledge that her cruelty a year ago had changed nothing. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her tone overly formal. "How domestic." Naomi looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Brennan, still spreading sunshine, I see." A few people nearby laughed. Clara's face reddened and she turned and walked away, her back rigid with indignation. "You're getting good at that," Elias murmured. "At what?" "Not letting people make you small." They finished their business in town and headed back to the homestead. On the way, Naomi thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, desperate, humiliated, certain her life was over. She'd been so wrong. Life hadn't ended on that platform. It had just begun differently than she'd imagined. November brought the first serious snow, and with it the knowledge that they'd be isolated again for months. But this time felt different. They weren't just surviving. They had a daughter to protect, a future to plan for. Clara was growing fast, becoming more alert, more engaged with the world. She'd focus on faces now, follow movement with her eyes, make small cooing sounds that weren't quite words but felt like communication. "What do you think she'll be like?" Naomi asked one evening, watching Clara wave her fists at nothing in particular. "Tough," Elias said immediately. "She'll have to be, growing up out here. But also kind. I want her to be kind. She'll be what she'll be. We'll just give her the tools to survive and the freedom to choose." Winter settled in hard and cold, but the house felt warmer with 3 people in it. Clara's presence changed everything, the way they structured their days, the things they worried about, the reasons they kept going when the work felt impossible. One night in December, during a particularly fierce storm, the chimney started smoking badly, filling the house with choking fumes. They couldn't fix it in the dark and the wind, so they bundled up Clara and themselves and spent the night in the barn with the animals. It was miserable, cold and uncomfortable, with the baby fussing and the cattle restless. But they made it through. In the morning, Elias climbed onto the roof and cleared the blockage, and they could return to the house. "This is our life," Naomi said, watching him work while she held Clara. "Crisis after crisis, problem after problem, and we just keep fixing things." But there was satisfaction in that, in knowing they could handle whatever came, in building something that didn't break the first time it was tested. January brought Clara's first real laugh, a delighted giggle when Elias made a funny face at her. The sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that both parents stopped what they were doing and just stared. "Do it again," Naomi said. He made the face again, and Clara laughed again, that beautiful baby laugh that sounded like every good thing in the world. "We made that," Elias said, wonder in his voice. "We made something that can laugh." February dragged like every February did, cold and dark and endless. But they had strategies now, ways to break up the monotony. Elias carved toys for Clara, simple blocks and rattles that she was just starting to grasp. Naomi sang to her, old songs from her childhood that she'd half forgotten until she needed them. March brought the slow thaw, and with it a visitor, the first they'd had all winter. A rider appeared in the valley one afternoon, picking his way through the mud and slush. Elias went out to meet him, rifle in hand, until he was sure of the stranger's intentions. Naomi watched from the window, Clara on her hip. The man was older, weathered, with a pack mule trailing behind his horse, some kind of peddler or traveling merchant. He and Elias talked for a few minutes, then Elias waved him toward the house. Says his name's Morrison, Elias explained. Travels the mountain settlements selling goods. Wondered if we needed anything. They didn't have money for luxuries, but Naomi looked through what he had anyway. Fabric, needles, thread, coffee, sugar, tobacco, small tools. Nothing they couldn't live without, but some things that would make life easier. The fabric, she said, pointing to a bolt of sturdy cotton. How much? They negotiated, and Naomi traded 3 of her preserved vegetable jars for enough fabric to make Clara a few new dresses. The baby was outgrowing everything. Morrison stayed for dinner, grateful for a hot meal and company. He told them news from other settlements, who'd had babies, who'd died, what the winter had been like in different parts of the territory. You folks doing all right out here? He asked. It's isolated, even by Montana standards. We manage, Elias said. More than manage, Morrison said, looking around the tidy house, the healthy baby, the well-stocked shelves. You're building something real. That's rare out here. Most people just scrape by. After he left, Naomi thought about that. Building something real. They were, weren't they? Not just surviving, but creating a life that mattered. Creating a home where Clara could grow up knowing she was wanted and valued. April brought warmth and the return of green to the valley. They planted the garden again, Clara lying on a blanket nearby, watching clouds or sleeping in the sun. The work was still hard, still endless, but it felt purposeful now. One afternoon, taking a break from planting, Naomi sat beside the baby and just looked out at the valley. The mountains still loomed. The isolation was still real, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like home. What do you think? She asked Clara, who grabbed at her finger with surprising strength. Think you'll like growing up here? Clara made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been gas. Naomi laughed. Elias came over, wiping dirt from his hands. Taking a break? Just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago, from 2 years ago. He sat beside her, looking out at the same view. Better or worse? Different. Harder in some ways, better in others. She glanced at him. I never thought I'd end up here. Never imagined this life. Regret it? No, not even a little bit. She meant it. Everything I lost, everything that went wrong, it led here, to you, to Clara, to this place, and I wouldn't trade it. Even though it's hard, especially because it's hard. Easy things don't mean anything. This means something. May brought news from town. Thomas Brennan had lost his ranch. Poor management and bad decisions had finally caught up with him. He'd sold out and moved east, taking his wife with him. Can't say I'm sorry to hear it, Elias said when they got the news. Naomi felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, just indifference. Thomas was irrelevant to her life now. What he'd done, while cruel, had ultimately set her on a path that led somewhere better than anything he could have offered. I should probably thank him, she said. If he hadn't been awful, I never would have met you. Let's not go that far. Summer came with all its demands. Clara was crawling now, getting into everything, requiring constant supervision. Naomi learned to work with one eye always on the baby, ready to intervene when she headed towards something dangerous. She's going to be trouble, Elias said, watching Clara pull herself up using a chair. She's going to be strong, Naomi corrected. There's a difference. July brought Clara's first birthday, and they marked it with a special dinner and a small cake Naomi managed to make from their precious sugar stores. Clara smashed her piece enthusiastically, getting more on her face than in her mouth. 1 year, Naomi said, watching her daughter play. 1 year since she came into the world screaming. Best year of my life, Elias said quietly. Mine too. August came around again, bringing memories of the birth and how scared they'd both been. But Clara was thriving, walking now, saying a few words, growing into a person with opinions and preferences. One afternoon, the three of them rode out to the upper meadow, the one where Naomi and Elias had stood 2 years ago, talking about regret and choices. Clara sat in front of Naomi on the saddle, pointing at everything and babbling happily. "We should bring the cattle up here for a few weeks," Elias said, surveying the grass. "It's good grazing." "We should build a line cabin," Naomi suggested. "Something small, just for when we need to stay up here during roundup." "That's a good idea. We could start this fall, have it ready for next spring." They were planning ahead now, thinking in terms of years instead of just making it through the next season. That shift felt significant. On the ride back, Clara fell asleep against Naomi's chest, and Naomi felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. This child would grow up knowing she was loved, would never feel like a burden or an unwanted obligation, would learn to work hard and value herself and not take cruelty from anyone. September brought the fall roundup, and they hired help again. 2 young cowboys who worked hard and didn't ask too many questions about the strange setup of a woman working alongside her husband while minding a toddler. The work went smoothly. The cattle were healthy, the grass had been good, and they'd have enough to sell some in the spring for a decent profit. "We might actually get ahead this year," Elias said, doing calculations at the table one evening while Clara played with her blocks nearby. "Don't say that, you'll jinx it. I'm being practical." "You're being optimistic. That's different for you." He looked up, almost smiling. "I learned it from someone." October brought the first snow, light and beautiful, dusting the valley in white. Clara was fascinated, touching the cold flakes with wonder. Naomi showed her how to catch them on her tongue, and the baby's delighted laugh echoed across the valley. Standing there watching her daughter experience snow for the first time, Naomi thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The humiliation on the platform, the desperate acceptance of Elias's offer, the brutal work and the fear and the slow building of trust. She thought about the woman she'd been, soft, uncertain, afraid of everything. And she thought about who she'd become, capable, strong, willing to face whatever came next. The change hadn't been smooth or easy. There had been setbacks and failures and days when she'd wanted to quit. But she hadn't. She'd kept going, kept building, kept believing that maybe, just maybe, she could create something worth having. And she had. That night, after Clara was asleep and the house was quiet, Naomi and Elias sat by the fire like they'd done countless times before. "I was thinking," Elias said, "about expanding, maybe adding another room to the house. Clara won't be a baby forever, and if we're lucky enough to have more children—" "I'd like that," Naomi interrupted. "More children, I mean, not right away, but eventually." "Yeah? Yeah. This is hard, but it's good. And Clara should have siblings, should have family." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, planning a future that once would have seemed impossible. A bigger house, more children, a ranch that could sustain them and pass down to the next generation. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Naomi said. "I think about that day on the platform. How certain I was that my life was over. How wrong I was. You couldn't have known how things would turn out." "No, but I'm glad I didn't give up. I'm glad I was desperate and stubborn enough to get on that wagon with you, even though it seemed insane." Elias reached for her hand. "I'm glad too. Can't imagine doing this without you anymore." "Good, because you're stuck with me." That's the best kind of stuck. November came and went, then December, the cycle of seasons that defined their lives. Winter locked them in again, but it felt different now. They had routines, strategies, confidence built from years of making it work. And they had each other. Had Clara, growing and learning and filling the house with noise and life. Had the knowledge that what they were building would outlast them, would continue long after they were gone. One night in January, during a fierce blizzard that rattled the windows and piled snow against the door, Naomi held Clara, now asleep, and looked around their small, warm house. At the shelves stocked with food they'd grown and preserved, at the fire burning in the hearth, at Elias working on plans for the expansion they'd build come spring. This was what she'd gambled everything for, though she hadn't known it at the time. Not pretty words or false promises, but honest work and honest love. A life built piece by piece, choice by choice, through setbacks and triumphs alike. She'd stepped off that train with nothing but a carpet bag and broken dreams. She'd been mocked, abandoned, left to figure out survival on her own terms. And she had. Not just survived, but built something that mattered. A home. a family, a legacy that would echo through the valley long after she and Elias were dust. The past didn't define her anymore. The humiliation, the fear, the desperate choices, they were just stepping stones that had led her here. To this moment, in this house, with this family, Naomi Carter had gambled on a lie and lost everything. But Naomi Vance had learned to bet on truth instead, and won far more than she'd ever dreamed possible. The blizzard howled outside, but inside they were warm and safe, and together. And that, Naomi thought, adjusting her sleeping daughter in her arms, was everything that mattered. The frontier had not broken her. She'd bent it to her will instead, carved out a place where she belonged, built a life on her own terms. Some stories ended with rescue, some with redemption. This one ended with a woman who'd rescued herself, standing in the home she'd built with her own hands, holding the future she'd fought for, knowing that whatever came next, she could handle it, because she always had, and she always would.